I watched Tom's hand tremble slightly as he pushed my bank statement across our mahogany dining table. $200,000, Becky, he said, his voice unnaturally calm. I need you to transfer it by tomorrow morning. The audacity of his demand made my blood run cold, but I maintained my composure, taking a slow sip of my morning coffee. 5 years of marriage, and here he was, asking for my life savings while his mistress, Vanessa, waited in their secret, Back Bay love nest. What Tom didn't know was that I'd already set things in motion. By tonight, at the Bristol overlooking Boston Harbor, he'd learn exactly who held the real power in Anderson Digital Solutions. The autumn morning light streamed through our Beacon Hill brownstone's windows, casting long shadows across the room. I remembered the day we'd bought this house, flush with success from our company's first major contract. Tom had been different. Then, or perhaps I'd just been blind to who he really was. Now, as I watched him fidget with his Rolex, the one Vanessa had surprisingly gifted him last month, I felt an odd sense of calm. That's a lot of money, Tom, I said quietly, watching his reflection in the window. Why such urgency? The way his shoulders tensed told me everything. He hadn't expected questions, hadn't prepared for resistance. That was always Tom's weakness, underestimating me, seeing me as nothing more than the supportive wife who'd helped him build his dream. It's a crucial investment opportunity, he replied, his rehearsed explanation flowing too smoothly. Time sensitive. The returns could double our company's value within a year. He reached for my hand, a gesture that once would have made my heart flutter. Now it just made my skin crawl. Trust me, honey. Have I ever steered us wrong? I thought about Meg Sullivan's words from last week, during our secret meeting in her corner office downtown. The documents she'd shown me, the paper trail linking Tom's business trips to extravagant gifts for Vanessa, the steady siphoning of company funds. But most importantly, the original investment agreements I'd signed when we first started Anderson. Digital Solutions, documents Tom had apparently never read carefully enough. The irony almost made me laugh. All those nights I'd spent managing our finances while he networked at fancy bars, all those weekends I'd sacrificed poring over contracts while he worked late. He'd never bothered to understand the foundation his success was built on. His ego wouldn't let him see that the woman he was betraying actually owned 51% of his precious company. You're right, Tom, I said, standing up slowly. Trust is everything in a marriage. I smoothed my skirt, enjoying the flash of relief on his face. That's why I've arranged a dinner meeting tonight at the Bristol. 8 o'clock. Bring Vanessa. The color drained from his face. What are you talking about? Oh, didn't I mention? I know all about the penthouse in Back Bay, the offshore account. The way you've been embezzling company funds to finance your affair. I picked up my briefcase, the one containing every shred of evidence I'd gathered over the past 6 months. I think it's time we all had an honest conversation about the future of Anderson Digital Solutions, don't you? His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The great Thomas Anderson, finally speechless. As I walked toward the door, I turned back one last time. And Tom, don't bother calling James Parker. Our company lawyer's already seen all the documentation. He'll be joining us tonight. The look of dawning horror on his face would stay with me forever. But this was just the beginning. By dessert, he'd understand exactly what happens when you mistake silence for weakness, when you demand a queen's ransom to pay for your mistress's lifestyle. I stepped out into the crisp Boston morning, my heels clicking against the cobblestones. Tonight would change everything, but for now, I had a company to run and a lesson to deliver. Sometimes the best revenge isn't served cold. It's served with an ironclad contract and a side of justice. If this story of resilience and empowerment resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe. Join our community of strong individuals who refuse to be victims of betrayal and instead choose to rise above, take control, and rewrite their own stories. Remember, True power often lies in knowing when to speak up and stand your ground. Stay tuned for what happens next at the Bristol, where Thomas Anderson will learn that his greatest mistake wasn't his affair, it was underestimating his wife. The Bristol's elegant dining room buzzed with quiet conversation as I adjusted the napkin on my lap, watching the sunset over Boston Harbor through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Crystal glasses caught the light, casting prisms across the pristine white tablecloth. The maitre d' had seated us at my preferred table, the corner spot offering both privacy and a clear view of the entrance. Every detail mattered tonight. Grace had helped me select my outfit, a deep burgundy dress that spoke of power without trying too hard, paired with the diamond earrings I'd bought myself after closing our biggest client last year. My grandmother's vintage Cartier watch completed the look, its gentle ticking marking each moment until Tom's arrival. The weight of the leather portfolio beside me held 6 months of carefully gathered evidence, each page a nail in the coffin of his deception. I watched the other diners, couples leaning close over candlelight, business associates in serious discussion, all unaware of the drama about to unfold. My hand remained steady as I lifted the martini glass, letting the slight burn of vodka calm my nerves. The text from James Parker had confirmed he was already waiting in the bar area, ready to join us at my signal. Meg Sullivan had insisted on having him present, though we both knew tonight wasn't really about legal proceedings. The soft buzz of my phone drew my attention. A message from Grace. "You've got this, B. Remember? You're not just fighting for yourself." She was right. This was about every woman who'd ever been underestimated, every partner whose contributions had been diminished or dismissed. The strange calm that had settled over me this morning remained, wrapped around me like armor. At precisely 8 o'clock, I saw them enter. Tom's confident stride faltered slightly as he spotted me, his hand tightening visibly on Vanessa's lower back. She was younger in person than in the photos I'd seen, dressed in a tight black number that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. My money, I realized with a touch of irony. The gifts, the shopping sprees, the weekend getaways, all funded by the very company I'd helped build. "Rebecca?" Tom's voice carried forced casualness as they approached. "I didn't expect." He trailed off, clearly thrown by my calm demeanor and the single place setting beside me. "Please, sit." I gestured to the chairs across from me. I took the liberty of ordering a bottle of Bordeaux. The 2015 you're so fond of, Vanessa. Though I believe you told Tom it was the 2014 when you shared it in Newport last month? The flash of shock across her face was almost comical. Tom's jaw clenched as they sat, his eyes darting around the restaurant as if searching for an escape route. The waiter appeared with perfect timing, presenting the wine with practiced flourish. I watched Vanessa's perfectly manicured fingers tremble slightly as she lifted her glass, her youth and uncertainty suddenly apparent in the warm restaurant lighting. "I suppose introductions are unnecessary," I continued, my voice carrying just enough edge to keep them on guard. "Though I must say, Vanessa, your LinkedIn profile doesn't do you justice. Head of operations at Mitchell Consulting? Quite impressive. For a company that doesn't seem to exist beyond a P.O. box in Providence." Tom's face flushed red. "Becky, if this is about this morning, this is about a lot more than this morning, Tom." I opened the portfolio, removing a single document. "This is about the $850,000 you've diverted from company accounts over the past 8 months, about the phantom consulting contracts and inflated expense reports. But mostly, it's about assumptions, like assuming I wouldn't notice, or that I wouldn't understand the complexities of corporate finance." The sound of Vanessa's wine glass hitting the table too hard drew glances from nearby diners. "Good. Let them watch. Let them see what happens next. Anyone hungry?" I smiled, signaling the waiter. "The chef's tasting menu is excellent tonight. We should have plenty to discuss over dinner. After all, as majority shareholder of Anderson Digital Solutions, believe in handling company business properly. The color drained from Tom's face. Majority. That's impossible. I founded the company. I built it from nothing. Did you? I removed another document, sliding it across the table. Because according to the original investment agreement you so carelessly filed away, my initial capital contribution entitled me to 51% ownership. You were so excited about the venture, you barely read the paperwork. Too busy being the face of the company, I suppose, while I was just the supportive wife handling the tedious details. The arrival of the first course provided a moment of excruciating silence. Vanessa stared at her plate, her earlier confidence evaporating with each passing second. Tom's hands shook as he reached for the investment agreement, his eyes scanning frantically for a loophole that didn't exist. And now, I continued, savoring the moment like the perfect sip of wine. You want my personal savings to fund what exactly? The down payment on that Back Bay penthouse you toured last week? Or perhaps it's for the offshore account you've been setting up in the Caymans. You don't understand, Tom started, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. The company needs new leadership. I cut him off smoothly. Starting tomorrow, you'll find your access to all company accounts suspended. The board has already been briefed on the situation. Meg Sullivan was particularly interested in the creative accounting you've been employing. The mention of Meg's name hit him like a physical blow. She had been his mentor, the one who had introduced us all those years ago. The betrayal in his eyes almost made me laugh, as if he had any right to feel betrayed. You can't do this, he whispered, but the defeat in his voice told me he already knew the truth. I absolutely could, and I had. Actually, Tom, I can, and I have. I gestured to James Parker, who approached from the bar right on cue. Mr. Parker has prepared 2 options for you. Option 1 involves a quiet resignation, a fair severance package, and a very comprehensive NDA. Option 2 is considerably less pleasant and involves the SEC. The night air carried the faint sound of boats in the harbor, a gentle reminder of the world continuing beyond our little drama. I watched Tom's world collapse in real time, his carefully constructed facade crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. Vanessa hadn't touched her wine since my revelation, her youth and inexperience never more apparent than in this moment. How strange that the night felt almost anticlimactic after months of planning, of carefully gathering evidence and building my case. But sometimes the quietest victories are the most satisfying. I didn't need grand gestures or public humiliation. The truth, presented calmly over fine wine and elegant cuisine, was devastating enough. The morning sun filtered through the office windows of Anderson Digital Solutions, casting long shadows across my desk as I reviewed the quarterly reports. Coffee steam rose from my favorite mug, the one Grace had given me when we first started. The company, behind every successful man is a woman rolling her eyes, it read. The irony wasn't lost on me. My finger traced over the day's schedule, each meeting meticulously planned, but my mind kept drifting to the strange tension in the air. Something felt different about the office today. The usual morning bustle seemed muted, conversations hushed, glances lingering a second too long. The corner office that had been Tom's sanctuary now sat dark, his prized autographed Patriots jersey still hanging on the wall. I'd have to take that down soon. Mark from accounting had dropped off some concerning files earlier, his normally cheerful demeanor replaced by nervous energy as he pointed out discrepancies in recent transactions. My phone buzzed with a message from Meg Sullivan. Lunch at Sorlina? We need to talk. A familiar knot formed in my stomach. Meg never suggested Sorlina unless something serious was brewing. Last time we'd met there, she'd hinted at irregularities in Tom's expense reports. That conversation had been the first thread that started unraveling the tapestry of his deception. The intercom buzzed. Mrs. Anderson? Mr. Thompson from First National Bank is here to see you. Sarah's voice carried an unusual edge. Interesting. Our banking relationship manager never made unscheduled visits. Send him in, Sarah. I straightened my blazer, mentally preparing for whatever new revelation was about to unfold. The heavy glass door swung open, revealing Richard Thompson's imposing figure, his typically jovial expression replaced by professional concern. Rebecca, he started, settling into the chair across from me. We need to discuss some unusual activity on the company accounts. He pulled out a folder, thick with documents. There's been a series of large transfers to an account we can't quite trace. I leaned back, watching him lay out paper trails I'd already memorized. My own investigation had revealed these transactions weeks ago, each one a breadcrumb leading to Tom's elaborate scheme. But hearing it from Richard, watching the professional mask slip as he detailed the suspicious patterns, made it all the more real. 300,000 transferred to a shell corporation in Delaware, Richard continued. Another 200,000 to an offshore account, all authorized by Mr. Anderson, but he paused, choosing his words carefully. The documentation seems irregular. The corner of my mouth twitched. Irregular how, Richard? Some of the authorization forms appear to have your signature, but when we compared them to your signature card, he spread out several documents, pointing to subtle differences in the handwriting. Tom had always been careful, but not careful enough. He'd forgotten I'd changed my signature slightly 2 years ago, adding a distinctive curl to the R that he hadn't noticed. I see, I said quietly, letting the silence stretch. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. We both knew what this meant. Forgery, fraud, possibly worse. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, mingling with the fading coffee, aroma, and the distant hum of office activity. Rebecca, as your bank's representative, I'm obligated to report this to our fraud department. Richard's voice was gentle but firm. Unless you can provide an explanation? I stood, walking to the window that overlooked Boston's financial district. The city sprawled below, a maze of ambitions and secrets. Somewhere down there, in a luxury condo I was paying for, Tom was probably with Vanessa, planning their next move, unaware that their house of cards was about to collapse. Actually, Richard, I can explain everything. I turned back to him, my reflection in the window glass overlaying the city skyline like a ghost. But first, I need to show you something else. I retrieved a USB drive from my desk drawer, one I'd been saving for exactly this moment. These are the real transaction records, and they tell a very interesting story. For the next hour, I walked Richard through the evidence I'd gathered. The fake consulting contracts Tom had created to funnel money to Vanessa's non-existent company. The inflated vendor invoices with kickbacks going to private accounts. The forged signatures on loan documents. With each revelation, Richard's expression grew darker. This is extensive, he finally said, running a hand through his graying hair. You've been tracking all of this? Since the first red flag appeared 6 months ago. I pulled up another file on my computer, this one showing a timeline of Tom's activities. I needed to understand the full scope before taking action. The intercom buzzed again. Mrs. Anderson, Ms. Mitchell is here to see you. Sarah's voice carried a note of surprise. Vanessa. Here. That was unexpected. I caught Richard's questioning look. Would you excuse me for a moment? I believe this might be relevant to our discussion. He nodded, gathering his papers as I buzzed. Back to Sarah. Send her in, please. Vanessa swept into the office like she owned it, designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. But something was off. Her usual confident posture was missing, replaced by a nervous energy that made her seem younger, more vulnerable. Rebecca, she started, then noticed Richard and faltered. I need to talk to you. About Tom. I gestured to the chair beside Richard. Please sit. Mr. Thompson from First National might be very interested in what you have to say." The color drained from her face as she sank into the chair, her expensive handbag clutched like a shield. "He's gone," she blurted out. "Tom, he emptied our joint account this morning and left a note saying he's flying to Singapore." Her hands shook as she pulled out an envelope. "He left this for you." The envelope felt heavy in my hands, not with weight, but with implications. Inside was a single page of Tom's distinctive stationery, his hurried handwriting betraying his panic. "I know you know everything," it began. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. You can have the company, it's worthless anyway. The accounts are empty." I couldn't help but smile, which seemed to unnerve both Vanessa and Richard. "Is that what he told you? That he cleaned out the accounts?" "He said he transferred everything offshore," Vanessa whispered. "That there's nothing left to take." I turned to my computer, typing briefly before swiveling the monitor toward them. "You mean these accounts?" On the screen were the company's main financial holdings, all intact, all secure. Tom's access was revoked 2 weeks ago. He's been seeing dummy accounts, showing exactly what I wanted him to see. The realization hit Vanessa like a physical blow. She slumped in her chair, the last vestiges of her composure crumbling. "He said we'd start a new life together. That he had everything planned." "Tom's always been good at planning," I agreed, my voice calm. "He just wasn't very good at noticing the details, like the fact that his wife might be smarter than he gave her credit for." The autumn rain pelted against the windows of Anderson. Digital Solutions, as I stood in what used to be Tom's office, methodically removing his personal items. Each object told its own story of deception. Receipts stuffed in desk drawers for jewelry I'd never received. Business cards from high-end hotels where he'd taken Vanessa. Photos of us that now seemed like portraits of strangers. My fingertips brushed against the smooth wooden surface of his desk, remembering how many late nights we'd spent here in the early days, dreaming about our future. Grace appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of steaming coffee. Her presence was a silent comfort as she watched me work. "The board meeting's been moved to 3 o'clock, she said softly, setting 1 cup on the desk. "Meg thinks it's better to handle everything today." The corner of a photograph peeked out from behind the desk calendar, Tom and me at the company's first major client celebration. I slipped it into the box without looking at it too long. "Did the forensic accountants finish their preliminary report?" "Just came in." Grace held up a thick manila envelope. "It's worse than we thought, Becky. The offshore accounts? The shell companies." He had an entire shadow operation running parallel to the legitimate business. I sank into Tom's leather chair, feeling its expensive comfort one last time. "Show me." Grace spread the documents across the desk, each page revealing another layer of Tom's elaborate scheme. Money had been flowing through a maze of fake consultancies, shell corporations, and numbered accounts. But what caught my eye wasn't the complexity of his fraud. It was the dates. "This started 3 years ago," I murmured, tracing the timeline with my finger. "Right after we landed the Morrison contract." The contract that had put Anderson Digital Solutions on the map, the one I'd stayed up countless nights perfecting, while Tom networked at industry events. The intercom buzzed. "Mrs. Anderson, there's a Ms. Mitchell here again. She says it's urgent." Sarah's voice carried a hint of uncertainty. I exchanged glances with Grace, who raised an eyebrow. "Want me to send her away?" "No," I decided, straightening my blazer. "Let's hear what she has to say. Send her up, Sarah." Vanessa looked different from our last encounter. Gone were the designer clothes and perfect makeup, replaced by a simple blouse and jeans. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her posture deflated. She clutched a laptop to her chest like a lifeline. "I found something," she said without preamble, her voice hoarse. "When Tom left, he gave me access to his personal email. I think you need to see this." Grace moved to stand protectively beside me as Vanessa set the laptop on the desk, pulling up an email chain. The first message was dated 2 years ago, from an account I didn't recognize, discussing the creation of a parallel company structure. He was planning this from the beginning, Vanessa continued, scrolling through messages. The affair, the embezzlement, it was all part of a larger plan. He wanted to drain the company slowly, build a duplicate business overseas, then transfer all the major clients once everything was in place. My hands remained steady as I read through the emails, each one revealing another piece of Tom's grand design. He'd chosen Vanessa not just for attraction, but because her background in finance made her useful. He'd been grooming her to help manage the shadow operation. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, studying her face carefully. Vanessa's lower lip trembled. "Because I was stupid. Because I believed him when he said his wife was just a figurehead. That you didn't understand business, because She paused, wiping at her eyes. "I didn't realize I was just another asset he was planning to dispose of." Grace scoffed quietly, but I held up a hand. "Go on." "There's more," Vanessa said, pulling up another folder. "These are recordings of his meetings with potential clients in Singapore. He's been promising them proprietary technology that belongs to Anderson Digital. He's going to steal your intellectual property." The rage I'd been suppressing threatened to surface, but I forced it down. "When did you discover all this?" "Last night," she whispered. "After he left. I started going through everything, trying to understand." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "He's not just betraying you. He's betraying everyone who ever trusted him." I leaned back in the chair, letting the weight of this new information settle. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the windows like nature's own soundtrack to this unfolding drama. The city beyond was a blur of gray, matching my mood. "Do you know what the real irony is?" I finally said, standing to look out at the rainy cityscape. He never bothered to read the technology patents, never cared about the legal details. Those proprietary systems he's promising to his new clients? They're not registered to Anderson Digital Solutions. I turned back to face them. They're registered to me personally, every single one. Grace's eyes widened in understanding, but Vanessa looked confused. "What does that mean?" "It means," I explained, "that even if he manages to take clients, even if he sets up his mirror company, he can't deliver what he's promising. The intellectual property he's banking his future on? He doesn't own it. He never did." The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor echoed as I walked back to the desk, picking up my coffee cup. It had grown cold, much like my feelings toward the man I'd once loved. "Thank you for bringing this to me, Vanessa. I assume you have copies of everything?" She nodded, reaching into her bag to produce a USB drive. "Everything's here, and..." She hesitated. "I'm willing to testify about all of it." Grace moved to take the drive, but I shook my head. "Give it to James Parker. He'll be here in an hour for the board meeting. He'll want to talk to you directly." Vanessa stood, clutching her laptop. She looked younger somehow, stripped of the confidence that money and power had temporarily given her. "What happens now?" "Now?" I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Now we show Tom exactly what happens when you underestimate the women in your life. All of them." I glanced at my watch. "The board meets in 2 hours. I suggest you use that time to write down everything you can remember. Every conversation, every promise, every plan he shared with you." After Vanessa left, Grace turned to me. "You're not seriously trusting her, are you?" "Trust has nothing to do with it," I replied, picking up another photograph from Tom's desk. This one showed him accepting an industry award, his smile confident, his pose practiced. She's doing what she needs to do to survive, just like I did. The difference is, I was playing a much longer game. I dropped the photograph into the box, watching the glass crack slightly as it landed. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of the life I'd thought I had. But I wasn't mourning anymore. I was planning, calculating, preparing for what came next. "Call Meg," I told Grace. "Tell her to bring every document she has about the original company formation. It's time to show the board exactly who they're dealing with." The boardroom of Anderson Digital Solutions hummed with tension as 12 pairs of eyes fixed on the presentation screen. Meg Sullivan stood at my side, her presence as solid as the mahogany table between us and the board members. The forensic accounting report, displayed in crisp detail, told a story of systematic deception that made several board members shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs. These transactions, I pointed to a particularly complex web of money movements, represent just 3 months of unauthorized fund diversions. As you can see, the pattern suggests premeditation rather than opportunity. My voice remained steady, professional, though my heart raced beneath my silk blouse. Harold Matthews, the eldest board member, removed his glasses slowly. "This is disturbing, Mrs. Anderson, but what concerns me more is the potential impact on our client's confidence. If this gets out—" "It won't," Meg interjected, her tone carrying the weight of 30 years in corporate law. "That's precisely why we're handling this internally today." I clicked to the next slide, revealing a chart of the company's current project portfolio. Our client contracts remain secure. The intellectual property Tom attempted to leverage is registered separately from company assets. I allowed myself a small smile. A precaution I took years ago, though not for reasons I could have anticipated. James Parker, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. "The Singapore venture?" "Will never materialize," I assured them. Without the proprietary systems he promised, Tom has nothing to offer potential clients. The technology stays with us. A murmur rippled through the room. These men and women, many of whom had known Tom for years, were seeing the full scope of his betrayal for the first time. Their shocked expressions would have been satisfying if the stakes weren't so high. The door opened quietly, and Sarah slipped in, handing me a note. My eyes scanned the message quickly. "Singapore authorities confirmed. Flight landed 2 hours ago." "Ladies and gentlemen," I addressed the board, tucking the note into my portfolio, "we have confirmation that Thomas Anderson has indeed fled to Singapore. This makes our next decisions crucial to the company's future." Bernard Cooper, our CFO, cleared his throat. "What exactly are you proposing, Rebecca?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was what all the preparation, all the careful documentation had led to. "I'm proposing a complete restructuring of the executive team. As majority shareholder—" "Majority shareholder?" Cooper interrupted, his face reddening. "Tom holds controlling interest. Everyone knows that." Meg stepped forward, distributing folders to each board member. "I suggest you review the original investment agreement. Page 3, paragraph 4 is particularly illuminating." The room fell silent save for the rustle of papers. I watched their faces as realization dawned. Cooper's complexion shifted from red to pale as he reached the relevant section. "This is impossible," he muttered. Tom never read the fine print," I stated simply. He was too focused on being the face of the company to concern himself with legal details, an oversight that has proven rather consequential. Martha Chen, head of our Asian operations, spoke up for the first time. "These signatures are verified?" "By 3 independent experts," Meg confirmed. "The document is ironclad." I moved to the windows, looking out at the Boston skyline as I gave them time to process. The afternoon sun glinted off neighboring buildings, creating a tapestry of light and shadow. How many times had I stood in this room, offering insights that Tom would later claim as his own? How many decisions had been credited to him when the strategies were mine? The choice before us is simple. I turn back to face them. We can announce Tom's departure as a personal decision to pursue other opportunities, maintain stability, and protect our stock price. Or we can allow this to become a public scandal that damages everyone in this room. Harold Matthews leaned forward. And what about the missing funds? Already located and in the process of being recovered, James Parker answered. Mrs. Anderson's documentation has given us everything we need to freeze the offshore accounts. The board members exchanged glances. They were business people above all else, and the math was simple. A smooth transition protected their investments. A scandal would cost them millions. There will, of course, be changes, I continued. The executive team requires restructuring, our financial oversight needs strengthening, and our corporate governance structure needs significant reform. Bernard Cooper's face had taken on a peculiar shade of gray. You've been planning this. For months, haven't you? I've been protecting this company's interests, I corrected him, which is more than I can say for some people in this room who chose to look the other way, while Tom systematically abused his position. The implication hung heavy in the air. Several board members suddenly found their notepads fascinating. Martha Chen straightened in her chair. I moved to accept Rebecca Anderson as CEO, effective immediately. The motion rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Harold Matthews seconded it almost immediately. The vote was unanimous, though Cooper's hand raised last, his expression sour. Thank you for your confidence, I said, gathering my materials. You'll find detailed transition plans in your folders, along with a press release draft for your review. We announce tomorrow morning. As the board members filed out, Meg touched my arm gently. You did it, Rebecca. I waited until the room was empty before allowing myself to sink into a chair. The magnitude of what had just transpired washed over me. Years of being underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed had led to this moment. Tom had never understood that my quiet competence wasn't weakness, it was patience. My phone buzzed with a message from Grace. Champagne chilling in your office. You earned this. I smiled, gathering my strength for one final meeting. The executive team would be waiting, nervous about their futures, wondering where they stood in the new order. It was time to show them exactly what kind of leader I would be. Firm but fair, decisive but collaborative. Everything Tom had pretended to be. The sun was setting as I walked to my office, casting long shadows through the corridors of power that were now truly mine. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But tonight, I would savor this victory, not just for myself, but for every woman who had ever been told to wait her turn, to play nice, to accept less than she deserved. 6 years earlier, the Boston financial district sparkled with promise as I walked into the sleek office building that would become my second home. The security guard tipped his hat. Morning, Mrs. Anderson, as I made my way to the elevator, clutching the business plan I'd spent months perfecting. Tom had dismissed it initially. Too conservative, he'd said, but Meg Sullivan had seen its potential. The memory of that morning felt like watching an old film, the edges soft with time but the details still sharp. I'd worn my navy suit, the one I'd saved 3 months to buy, my grandmother's watch, my only jewelry. The weight of my student loans still pressed heavily, but I'd believed in our vision enough to risk everything. I remembered Tom's excitement as we'd pitched to potential investors, his charisma filling the room while I provided the substance behind his showmanship. The perfect partnership, everyone had said. If only they'd known how those words would turn bitter. The corner office that would later become Tom's domain was empty then, nothing but potential and morning light. We'd stood there together, his arm around my waist, planning where everything would go. Your desk here, he'd said, pointing to the spot by the window. Best view in the house for my brilliant wife. I never did get that desk. Somehow, as the company grew, I found myself in a smaller office down the hall. "It's more practical," Tom had insisted. "You need to be closer to the financial team." I'd accepted it then, like I'd accepted so many small surrenders. Meg had been different from the start. She'd seen through Tom's charm to recognize the real architect of our success. During lunch meetings, she'd direct her questions to me, not him. When contracts needed reviewing, she'd seek my opinion first. Tom had been too confident in his position to notice these subtle shifts in power. The initial investment had come from my savings, scraped together from years of careful planning and strategic consulting work. Tom had been between jobs, his latest startup having fizzled out. He'd pitched the idea of Anderson Digital Solutions over dinner one night, all enthusiasm and grand gestures. I'd listened, calculated, and seen the potential. Not in his vision, but in what I could make of it. The day we signed the incorporation papers, I'd asked Tom if he wanted to review them one last time. He'd laughed, signing with a flourish before heading off to celebrate with friends. I'd stayed late with Meg, ensuring every detail was perfect. Every clause exactly as we'd planned. That night marked the beginning of both our success and our undoing. Success came quickly. My strategy of focusing on mid-sized companies overlooked by larger consulting firms proved profitable. Tom became the face of the company, charming clients at expensive restaurants, while I built the systems and processes that actually served them. I didn't mind then. I'd always preferred working behind the scenes. The first warning signs were subtle: expense reports with missing receipts, client meetings that didn't appear on any official calendar, late nights at the office that produced no visible work. I'd ignored them all, burying myself in growing the company, telling myself that success required sacrifice. Our 5th anniversary. Dinner was at L'Espalier, Tom ordering champagne and reminiscing about the early days. I'd worn the emerald necklace he'd given me the year before, not yet knowing it had a twin around another woman's neck. His phone kept buzzing throughout dinner. "Work never stops," he'd said with that confident smile I once found charming. Looking back, I could trace the pattern of his deception like a constellation, each star a moment I should have questioned more deeply. The company's rapid expansion had provided perfect cover for his schemes. Who would notice a few irregular transactions amid the chaos of growth? Grace had tried to warn me, in her gentle way. "Are you sure Tom understands the financial side, as well as he claims?" she'd asked one day, reviewing some unusual consulting fees. I'd defended him then, still playing the role of loyal wife and business partner. The Morrison contract had been my triumph, though few knew it. 60 hours of work compressed into 1 week, every detail meticulously planned. Tom had presented it to the board as his achievement, accepting their congratulations with practiced humility. That night, watching him bask in praise he hadn't earned, something shifted inside me. I began keeping records, small things at first, notes about discrepancies, copies of unusual transactions. A separate email account, secured with passwords Tom would never guess, became my digital vault. Each piece of evidence another brick in the wall between who I had been and who I would become. The company's success had given Tom opportunities he'd never had before. Access to power, to money, to people who took his word as gospel. He'd grown careless with that power, assuming his position was unassailable. Like many men before him, he'd forgotten to look behind the throne. The day I discovered Vanessa's existence, I felt something close to relief. Finally, a reason to stop pretending. I'd come across her name buried in an expense report, a hotel charge in Providence when Tom was supposedly in New York. One thread pulled, and the whole tapestry began to unravel. I didn't confront him then. Instead, I watched, documented, and planned. Each late night when he thought I was working on quarterly reports, I was actually building my case. Every business trip that gave him time with Vanessa gave me time to gather more evidence. The irony was that he'd taught me this patience, though not intentionally. Years of watching him negotiate, of seeing how he played the long game with clients, had shown me the value of timing. I learned from his successes and his mistakes, building my own strategy with the precision he'd never bothered to develop. Meg had recognized the change in me. Over lunch one day, she'd studied me with those shrewd eyes that had seen through so many corporate facades. "You're ready," she'd said simply. Not asking what I planned, not offering advice, just acknowledging the transformation she'd witnessed. I'd built Anderson Digital Solutions as surely as if I'd laid each foundation stone myself. The systems, the processes, the relationships that kept us growing, they were all mine. Tom had been the front man, the showman, the face everyone associated with our success. But I was the architect, the engineer, the quiet force that turned his promises into reality. The company's DNA carried my fingerprints, not his. Every line of code, every client solution, every innovation that set us apart, they all stemmed from my vision. Tom had sold the dream, but I had made it real. And now, as his house of cards trembled on the edge of collapse, I stood ready to reclaim what had always been mine. A crisp winter morning painted the Boston skyline in shades of gold as I sat in my home office, surrounded by stacks of documents and 3 computer monitors. Each screen displayed different aspects of Tom's deception: financial trails, email correspondences, and surveillance photos. The coffee beside me had grown cold, forgotten in the intensity of my focus. My dining room table had transformed into a war room over the past month. Grace arrived every morning at 7, armed with fresh intel and steaming lattes. Today, she studied a complex flowchart tracking money through various shell companies, while I cross-referenced dates with Tom's travel records. "Look at this," Grace pointed to a series of transactions. "Every time he meets with Vanessa, there's a corresponding withdrawal from the Morrison Project account. He's not even trying to hide it anymore." I enlarged a bank statement on my center monitor, tracing the pattern she'd spotted. "He thinks no one's watching. That's exactly what we need." My fingers flew across the keyboard, adding another piece to our growing documentation. The doorbell chimed, right on schedule. James Parker entered, his leather briefcase bulging with legal documents. He'd been working through the night, his slightly rumpled appearance betraying the long hours. "The Singapore connections are deeper than we thought," he announced, spreading papers across my carefully organized chaos. Email alerts pinged steadily on my right monitor. Messages from our network of private investigators, financial analysts, and corporate informants. Each one added another thread to the tapestry we were weaving. Tom's activities in Asia had left a trail that only someone who knew where to look could follow. "Their corporate registration was filed 3 months ago," James continued, pointing to a document. "He's been setting this up since before the Morrison deal closed. But here's where it gets interesting." He pulled out another paper, this one showing a familiar signature. "Look who else is listed as a director." Vanessa's name jumped off the page, along with her full credentials, including degrees and certifications she'd never actually earned. I couldn't help but admire the thoroughness of Tom's deception, even as I plotted its unraveling. My phone buzzed with a text from Meg. "Board member Thompson asking questions. Lunch tomorrow?" I responded quickly, confirming the meeting. We'd need the board's full support when everything came to light. Grace sorted through another pile of documents, her organizational skills proving invaluable. "The pattern goes back further than we thought. Look at these expense reports from last year. The client meetings in Providence? They match perfectly with Vanessa's social media posts at the same hotels." I pulled up my secure email account, adding this new information to our timeline. The evidence was overwhelming, but it had to be presented perfectly. One misstep, one detail out of place, and Tom's charm might be enough to spin it away. The grandfather clock in my hallway chimed 10 as Sarah buzzed in on my secure line. "Mrs. Anderson?" That contact from the Singapore exchange finally called back. Should I patch them through? Put them in my private conference room, I replied, heading to the specially secured space I'd set up in my guest room. The walls were soundproofed, the electronics swept daily for bugs. Paranoid, perhaps, but necessary. The call revealed exactly what we'd suspected. Tom had been making promises he couldn't keep, leveraging intellectual property he didn't own. The Singapore exchange representative was concerned about potential fraud, though they didn't yet know the half of it. Back in my dining room, James was on his phone, speaking quietly with his contacts at the SEC. We weren't filing anything yet, but groundwork had to be laid. Timing would be everything. Grace appeared at my elbow with fresh coffee and a concerned expression. Vanessa's been asking questions at the office, subtle ones, but she's definitely fishing for information about the company's structure. I sipped the coffee, considering this development. Let her ask. The more she digs, the more likely she is to discover what Tom's really planning for her. Sometimes the best weapon is the truth. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my evidence wall, a giant corkboard covered in photos, documents, and red string connecting the pieces. It looked like something from a detective show, but every connection was meticulously verified, every piece of evidence triple-checked. My secure tablet pinged with an alert from our IT team. Tom had accessed the company servers remotely, downloading client files. Little did he know, he was seeing exactly what we wanted him to see, carefully crafted decoys that would lead him further down his chosen path. James finished his call and turned to me. SEC's interested, very interested, but they want more. Concrete evidence of intent. Show them this. I pulled up a folder on my secure drive. Every email Tom sent to potential investors in Singapore, promising technology he can't deliver. Every presentation claiming ownership of patents he doesn't control. Every single lie, documented and dated. Grace whistled softly, scrolling through the evidence. He really thought he'd get away with all this? He never bothered to understand the details, I replied, highlighting a particularly damning email chain. He assumed I was just handling paperwork, not building safeguards. The sound of printers hummed in the background as we prepared another set of documents for tomorrow's meeting with the board member. Each piece of evidence would be presented in a specific order, building an irrefutable case. My phone buzzed again, this time a message from our surveillance team. Tom was meeting Vanessa for dinner at their usual spot in Back Bay. Perfect. Let them plan and plot, each step taking them closer to the trap we'd laid. As evening approached, Grace and James packed up, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my evidence. The city lights began to twinkle beyond my windows, each one a reminder of the world Tom thought he could conquer through deception. I stood at my window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful preparation, another step closer to the moment when everything would change. In my reflection, I saw not the woman Tom had underestimated, but the architect of his downfall, patiently constructing the perfect endgame. The grandfather clock struck 7, its chimes echoing through my now quiet home. Time was on my side, moving inexorably toward the day when justice would be served, not with violence or scandal, but with the cold, hard truth Tom had never bothered to see. Snow drifted past the windows of my Beacon Hill brownstone as I sat alone in my study, surrounded by the evidence of my life with Tom. Old photographs spread across my desk told the story of our relationship. Young, ambitious dreamers at industry, events, charity galas, company parties. Each image now seemed like a carefully staged production, with Tom as the director and me as an unwitting actor in his play. My fingers traced the edge of our wedding photo, remembering the hope and trust in my eyes that day. The ivory dress I'd chosen, the flowers carefully arranged, my father's proud smile as he walked me down the aisle. How many decisions had I made then, thinking they were steps toward our shared future, when they were really just moves in Tom's elaborate game? The quiet of the house pressed in around me, broken only by the gentle ticking of my grandmother's antique clock. I'd always loved these peaceful evening hours, but tonight they felt different. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was anticipatory, like the hushed moment before an orchestra begins to play. Grace had left hours ago, taking with her another stack of documents for safekeeping. "You don't have to do this alone," she'd said, squeezing my shoulder. But I did. Some journeys had to be walked in solitude, some battles fought in the quiet chambers of one's own heart. My wedding ring caught the lamplight as I reached for my journal, the one I'd started keeping when the first doubts about Tom began to surface. Its pages held more than just evidence of his betrayal. They contained the story of my own awakening. The gradual realization that the man I'd married existed only in my imagination, carefully crafted by Tom to suit his purposes. A text message lit up my phone screen, Vanessa, of all people. "Can we meet? There's something you should know." I let the message sit unanswered, watching the snow gather on the windowsill. She was scared now, finally beginning to understand her role in Tom's grand design. How familiar that fear felt, how well I remembered my own moment of clarity. The kitchen still held traces of our last normal morning together, his coffee cup in the sink, the newspaper folded to the business section he'd been reading. Such ordinary things now loaded with meaning. Had he known then what was coming? Had he seen the change in me, the steel beneath the silk? I moved through the house like a ghost, touching familiar objects that suddenly felt foreign. The artwork we'd chosen together, the furniture we'd argued over, the books on our shelves, each item a piece of the life we'd built, or rather, the life I'd thought we were building together. In our bedroom, his closet stood half empty, designer suits and Italian shoes missing from their usual places. He'd packed carefully, methodically, just as he'd planned his betrayal. But he'd left behind his first briefcase, the worn leather one he'd carried when we met. Perhaps he thought it too shabby for his new life, or perhaps it held too many memories of the man he'd pretended to be. The bed we'd shared for 5 years felt enormous now, the silence of the room profound. How many nights had I lain here, listening to his breathing, believing his lies? How many mornings had I watched him dress for work, never suspecting that each perfectly knotted tie concealed another deception? My phone buzzed again, Meg this time. "Everything's in place. Are you sure about tomorrow?" I typed a quick affirmative, my resolve stronger than ever. Tomorrow would change everything, but tonight belonged to memory, to understanding, to finally facing the truth of what I'd lost and what I'd gained. I found myself in Tom's study, the room that had always been his sanctuary. The leather chair behind his desk still held his shape, the surface still cluttered with his things. A half-empty tumbler of scotch stood beside a stack of business magazines, his face smiling from the cover of one, Boston's rising tech star. The irony wasn't lost on me. Opening his desk drawer, I found the card I'd given him on our first anniversary. My handwriting, so full of hope and love, promised a lifetime of support and partnership. He'd kept it, all these years. Was it sentiment? Or just another prop in his elaborate performance? The snow was falling harder now, blanketing the city in white silence. From my window, I could see the lights of other homes, other lives untouched by the storm brewing in mine. How many other women were sitting in quiet rooms tonight, processing their own betrayals, finding their own strength? My reflection in the window caught me by surprise. I looked different somehow, stronger perhaps, or simply more aware. The woman who had trusted so easily, who had given so much of herself to Tom's dreams, was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered by truth. A distant church bell tolled midnight as I gathered the photographs into a box. Each image a lesson learned, each smile a reminder of what I'd survived. The woman in these pictures had died a quiet death, giving birth to someone stronger, wiser, more capable of facing the truth. Tomorrow would bring action, consequences, justice. But tonight was for mourning. Not for the loss of Tom or the marriage he'd destroyed, but for the death of illusions, the end of innocence, the final farewell to a woman who had loved too, trustingly and learned too late. I poured myself a glass of wine, not Tom's favorite vintage, but mine. Standing at the window, watching the snow transform the city into something pure and new, I raised a silent toast to endings and beginnings, to truth and consequences, to the woman I had been and the one I was becoming. The house settled around, me creaking softly in the winter night. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing the familiar lines of the world and making way for something new. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it the storm I'd so carefully prepared. But for now, in this quiet moment between what was and what would be, I allowed myself to feel everything: the pain, the anger, the grief, and beneath it all, a fierce and growing sense of freedom. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Anderson Digital Solutions as I stood in the executive conference room, watching the city come alive. The boardroom table gleamed with fresh polish, each place set with leather portfolios containing the evidence we'd gathered. My reflection in the window showed a woman transformed, hair perfectly styled, designer suit crisp, eyes clear with purpose. Grace entered silently, placing a steaming cup of coffee at my usual seat. The executive team is gathering in the lobby. Meg just texted. She's 5 minutes out with the legal team. Her voice carried a mix of excitement and tension. Tom's Singapore office just opened for the day. I checked my watch, a delicate Cartier that had been a gift to myself after our first major client success. Right on schedule. Has he logged into the system yet? It confirms he accessed the servers 20 minutes ago. He's downloading the fake client files we planted. Grace's smile held a touch of satisfaction. The tracking software is active. Every keystroke, every download, every message, we're capturing it all. The sound of elevator doors opening down the hall signaled the arrival of our executive team. They filed in one by one, faces tense with uncertainty. These were good people, talented professionals who had helped build this company. Some had known about Tom's deceptions, others had suspected, and a few had been completely blind to his manipulations. Bernard Cooper entered last, his usual confidence notably diminished. As CFO, he'd either been complicit in Tom's schemes or criminally negligent in his oversight. Either way, his future would be decided today. "Good morning," I greeted them, my voice steady and assured. "Please take your seats. We have much to discuss." The rustle of papers and scraping of chairs filled the room as everyone settled in. Through the glass walls, I could see Meg approaching with her team of lawyers. James Parker arrived moments later, carrying additional documents that completed our arsenal. The morning light caught his silver hair as he took his place beside me, arranging papers with practiced precision. "Before we begin," I addressed the room, "I want to be clear about something. What happens in the next hour will determine not just the future of this company, but your individual futures as well. Those who choose honesty and cooperation will find their loyalty rewarded. Those who don't." I let the implication hang in the air. Meg entered with her legal team, nodding slightly to indicate everything was in place. The weight of the moment pressed around us like a physical presence. As I moved to the head of the table, "Let's start with the Singapore operation," I began, pressing a button that brought the main screen to life. A complex web of transactions appeared, each line connecting to shell companies and hidden accounts. "Mr. Cooper, perhaps you'd like to explain these financial movements?" Bernard's face paled as he recognized the transactions. These are standard international business operations." "Are they?" I changed the display to show another set of documents. "Because our records Show these particular transactions have no corresponding business activities, no contracts, no deliverables, no actual services rendered. Just money moving through increasingly complex channels. The room grew painfully quiet as realization dawned on the executives' faces. Some looked shocked, others guilty, a few resigned. I moved through the evidence methodically, building an irrefutable case of fraud, embezzlement, and corporate espionage. The technology Tom promised to our Singapore investors doesn't exist in the form he described, I continued. The patents and intellectual property he claimed to control are actually registered to a separate entity, one he has no authority over. A gasp came from the end of the table as recognition hit. Linda Chen, our head of technology, finally, understood why I'd insisted on certain legal structures years ago. Her eyes met mine with newfound respect. At this moment, James Parker took over. Tom is accessing what he believes are proprietary company files. In reality, he's providing us with documented evidence of his intent to defraud both our company and our potential investors. The screen behind me updated in real time, showing Tom's activities on the company servers. Each click, each download, each attempt to access restricted files was another nail in the coffin of his deception. Those of you who assisted Tom, whether actively or through deliberate ignorance, have a choice to make. I placed a stack of documents on the table. These are individual agreements offering immunity in exchange for full cooperation with our internal investigation. You have exactly 1 hour to decide. Bernard Cooper's hand shook as he reached for the papers. Others followed suit, the rustle of pages filling the tense silence. Meg's legal team moved around the room, ready to witness signatures and notarize statements. "Mrs. Anderson," Linda spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "The client contracts. If Tom has promised technology we can't deliver, every valid client contract will be honored," I assured her. "The technology exists. It's simply not owned by the entity Tom claimed. As majority shareholder and owner of the intellectual property in question, I'll ensure all legitimate business obligations are met." The phrase majority shareholder caused another stir in the room. Bernard's head snapped up, his face a mix of disbelief and dawning comprehension. I could almost see him mentally reviewing years of documents, finally understanding the magnitude of Tom's oversight. My phone buzzed with an update from our IT team. Tom had just discovered his access to critical systems had been revoked. In Singapore, he would be realizing that his carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing. Those who choose not to cooperate should be aware that the SEC has already been briefed. James Parker's voice cut through the murmurs. Their investigation will be thorough. I watched as the reality of their situation settled over the room. These people had built careers on their association with Tom, had believed in his vision, had trusted his leadership. Now they were facing the consequences of that trust. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the conference table. In the distance, Boston's financial district hummed with activity, unaware that within these walls, an empire was being reconstructed. Let them choose, I thought, watching their internal struggles play out across their faces. Let them understand that loyalty, like respect, must be earned through actions, not promises. The company would survive this transition, emerging stronger, more transparent, more ethical. A new day was dawning for Anderson Digital Solutions, and with it, a new era of leadership, one built on substance rather than show, on integrity rather than illusion. The transformation had begun. The doors of Anderson Digital Solutions swung open as Vanessa Mitchell strode through the lobby, her designer heels echoing against marble floors. Her face, usually perfectly composed, showed signs of strain. Dark circles lurked beneath expertly applied concealer, and her hands clutched her leather portfolio a bit too tightly. Security guards watched her carefully, They'd been briefed about her arrival. Sarah's voice crackled through my intercom. "Ms. Mitchell is here for your meeting." The neutrality in her tone masked weeks of practiced preparation for this moment. Every employee had been carefully instructed on their role in today's events. "Send her up," I replied, standing to adjust my view of the Boston skyline. The city sprawled below, unaware of the drama unfolding in this tower of glass and steel. Somewhere across the world, Tom was discovering that his carefully constructed escape route was crumbling. Vanessa entered my office with an attempt at her usual confidence, but uncertainty flickered in her eyes as she took in the changes. Tom's personal items were gone, replaced by subtle indicators of the company's new direction. The massive abstract painting he'd insisted on now gave way to a sleek digital display showing real-time company metrics. "Thank you for coming," I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "I believe you have something to discuss." The leather creaked softly as she sat, her composure cracking slightly at the edges. "He lied to me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything," he promised. "Everything he said about the company, about our future." She pulled documents from her portfolio, spreading them across my desk. "These arrived this morning. Transfer papers, putting company assets in my name. But they're worthless, aren't they?" I studied the papers, exact copies of documents we'd been tracking for weeks. Tom's desperate attempt to create a safety net was unraveling faster than even I had anticipated. He tried to transfer assets he doesn't control. Classic Tom, always assuming he had more power than he actually did. Vanessa's perfectly manicured hands trembled as she reached for the glass of water Sarah had thoughtfully provided. "There's more. The Singapore investors. They're asking questions I can't answer. Technical specifications, implementation details. Tom said it would all be handled, but the technology they want doesn't belong to the entity Tom claimed to represent," I finished for her. "Did he ever show you the actual patents? The ownership documentation?" She shook her head, realization dawning in her eyes. "He said it was all proprietary, that I didn't need to worry about the details." A bitter laugh escaped her. "I was so stupid, a partner at 29 heading up international operations. I should have known it was too good to be true." My computer pinged softly, an alert from our monitoring system. Tom had just tried to access his emergency accounts, only to find them frozen. The trap was closing, one calculated step at a time. "The Singapore authorities have some questions for him," I mentioned casually, watching her reaction. "The Securities Commission there takes a particularly dim view of technology fraud, especially when it involves international investors." Color drained from Vanessa's face. "Technology fraud?" "But he said—" She stopped, drawing a shaky breath. "He said a lot of things, didn't he? And I believed every word." Grace appeared, in the doorway, right on schedule. "Sorry to interrupt, but the SEC investigators are here for their meeting." The timing was perfect. We'd planned this moment carefully to maximize its impact. Vanessa's composure finally cracked. "SEC? He swore everything was legitimate, said I'd be protected?" Fear crept into her voice as the full implications of her situation became clear. "You have a choice to make," I said quietly, pulling a folder from my desk drawer. "These documents outline everything we know about Tom's operations, including your role in them. You can leave now, try to handle the fallout on your own, or... Her voice quavered slightly. "Or you can help us ensure that Tom faces the consequences of his actions. Your choice." I placed a pen beside the folder. "But consider this. Only one of these options comes with the protection of our legal team." Tears threatened to spill from her carefully made-up eyes. "He said he loved me. Said we'd build something amazing together." Her laugh was hollow. "I gave up everything for him. My reputation, my career." Tom has a way of making people believe in his version of reality, I acknowledged. The question is, what are you going to do now that you see the truth? Outside my office, I could see the SEC team being escorted to the conference room. Their presence would soon send ripples through the financial community. Tom's reputation wouldn't survive the scrutiny. Vanessa reached for the pen with shaking fingers. I never wanted. I didn't know. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. What do you need to know? For the next hour, she detailed everything. The secret meetings, the promises, made to investors, the elaborate web of deception Tom had woven. Each revelation confirmed what we'd already documented, but her testimony would provide the personal element prosecutors loved. My phone buzzed constantly as updates poured in. Tom's assets were being frozen across multiple jurisdictions. His carefully planned escape route was dissolving before he could fully execute it. Soon, he would have nowhere left to run. There's one more thing, Vanessa said finally, her voice stronger now. The offshore accounts. They're not just for company money. He's been moving personal assets, setting up trusts under different names. He told me it was for tax purposes, but I nodded, adding this information to our growing file. Tom's desperation was becoming evident in his increasingly risky moves. Each attempt to secure his position only provided more evidence of his fraudulent intent. Grace appeared again, this time with fresh coffee and a subtle signal. The SEC. Interviews were about to begin. Vanessa noticed the shift in energy, her professional instincts still sharp despite her emotional turmoil. What happens now? She asked, watching the investigators through the glass walls. To the company? To me? That depends largely on you, I replied, gathering the signed documents. Cooperation goes a long way toward redemption. The company will survive. We're already implementing new leadership and transparency measures. Your future, however, is in your hands. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my office as Vanessa made her decision. In the end, self-preservation won out over loyalty to Tom. She would testify, provide evidence, help unravel the complex scheme she'd unwittingly become part of. As she left with our legal team, I stood at my window, watching the city below. Tom's carefully constructed world was crumbling, not with a bang, but with the quiet efficiency of legal documents and sworn statements. Sometimes the most devastating weapons weren't dramatic gestures, but simple, undeniable truths. The real work was just beginning, rebuilding trust, restructuring operations, ensuring that such deception could never happen again. But for now, watching Vanessa's testimony set events in motion, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The truth, as they say, would set us free. I stood at the podium in Anderson Digital Solutions' main conference room, facing a sea of reporters eager for details about the company's sudden leadership change. Camera flashes punctuated the air like lightning as I smoothed my charcoal gray suit, the one I'd bought specifically for this moment. Beside me, Meg Sullivan nodded encouragingly, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of media attention. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. My voice carried clearly through the room, years of boardroom presentations evident in my measured tone. Today marks a new chapter for Anderson Digital Solutions. As majority shareholder and newly appointed CEO, I want to address the recent changes in our executive leadership. The reporters leaned forward, digital recorders raised. Everyone wanted the story behind Thomas Anderson's sudden departure. The whispers of financial irregularities, the rumors of international investigations. They'd get their story, but on my terms, in my way. Our company was built on innovation, integrity, and trust. When those principles were compromised, immediate action became necessary. My eyes swept the room, meeting the gaze of key industry journalists. We've implemented comprehensive leadership changes to ensure our clients' interests remain protected. Questions erupted like a wave. Mrs. Anderson, can you comment on Thomas Anderson's current location? Are the rumors of SEC involvement true? What about the Singapore operations? I held up a hand, maintaining control of the narrative. We are cooperating fully with relevant regulatory authorities. As for specific details, those will emerge through proper channels. Our focus now is on serving our clients and strengthening our corporate governance. Grace appeared at the back of the room, giving me our prearranged signal. Tom's Singapore accounts had just been frozen. Right on schedule. The carefully orchestrated dance of international law enforcement and financial regulations was playing out exactly as planned. Andersen Digital Solutions remains financially strong, with a robust client portfolio and groundbreaking technological innovations in development. I gestured to the screens behind me, displaying our latest performance metrics. Our commitment to excellence and ethical business practices has never been stronger. A veteran reporter from the Financial Times raised her hand. Sources suggest there were irregularities in technology licensing agreements. Can you address these concerns? All our intellectual property rights are properly registered and protected, I replied smoothly. Any unauthorized attempts to leverage our technology will be addressed through appropriate legal channels. The subtle emphasis on unauthorized sent ripples through the room. James Parker stepped forward then, right on cue. As lead counsel for Andersen Digital Solutions, I can confirm that all company patents and proprietary systems remain securely under original ownership. Any claims to the contrary are without merit. The press conference continued. Each question met with carefully prepared responses that revealed enough to satisfy immediate curiosity while protecting our legal strategy. Through it all, I maintained the composure I'd practiced for weeks, presenting the image of confident leadership rather than personal vindication. Afterward, in the privacy of my office, Meg poured 2 glasses of champagne. "Perfectly handled," she said, handing me one. "The markets are already responding positively. Stocks up 12% since the announcement." I sipped the champagne, letting the bubbles dance on my tongue. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Boston's financial district sparkled in the afternoon sun, unaware that one of its most prominent figures was watching his empire crumble from halfway around the world. My phone buzzed with a message from our legal team in Singapore. Tom's attempts to access emergency funds had been blocked. His calls to former business associates went unanswered. The man who had built his life on relationships was discovering how quickly those ties could be severed. Grace entered with the latest updates. The board's statement of support has been released. Client retention numbers are holding steady, and... She paused, a slight smile playing at her lips. Vanessa's testimony has been formally recorded. The pieces were falling into place, domino after carefully positioned domino. Each move we'd planned, each contingency we'd prepared for, had led to this moment. The company would survive, emerging stronger and more transparent. Tom's legacy would be nothing more than a cautionary tale. My computer chimed with an incoming email, Tom's first attempt at communication since everything began. The subject line read simply, "Why?" I left it unopened. Another small victory in the battle of wills he didn't know he'd already lost. The afternoon wore on, a steady stream of calls and meetings filling the hours. Clients needed reassurance. Employees needed direction. The media needed carefully crafted statements. Through it all, I maintained the calm authority that had become my trademark. As evening approached, I found myself alone in what had once been Tom's office, now transformed into a space that reflected the company's new direction. The pretentious artwork was gone, replaced by displays showing real-time project updates and client metrics. The leather-bound books he'd never read had given way to actual technical manuals and industry analyses. In the gathering dusk, my reflection in the window seemed different, stronger, more assured. The woman who had once accepted a lesser role, who had allowed her contributions to be minimized, was gone. In her place stood someone who knew her worth, who understood that true power came not from titles or appearances, but from quiet competence and careful planning. The city lights began to twinkle on, each one a star in the urban galaxy I now commanded. Somewhere in Singapore, Tom was facing the ruins of his ambitions. His calls to attorneys went straight to voicemail. His business? Contacts suddenly had pressing engagements elsewhere. The man who had always considered himself the smartest person in the room was learning a harsh lesson about underestimating others. A final message from our legal team confirmed what I'd known would happen. Tom's attempts to transfer company assets had been officially blocked. The technology he'd promised to investors remained firmly under my control. His house of cards hadn't just collapsed. It had been systematically dismantled, brick by carefully documented brick. I raised my glass to the city skyline, a private toast to endings and beginnings. The company would move forward under new leadership, guided by principles of transparency and integrity. And I would lead it, not from behind a man's shadow, but from the front, where I had always belonged. The winter sun hung low in the Boston sky as I signed the final documents in the Anderson Digital Solutions boardroom. Each signature represented another piece of the company's future secured, another step toward the transformation I'd engineered. Outside, snow fell softly on the financial district, covering the city in a blanket of pristine white. Meg Sullivan gathered the papers, her practiced eye checking every detail one last time. "It's done," she said simply, sliding them into her briefcase. "The company is officially yours, in name as well as fact." The weight of the moment settled around me like a familiar coat. In the past months, I'd orchestrated the most significant corporate transition in Boston's recent history, all while maintaining the calm exterior that had become my trademark. Now, watching the snow drift past the windows, I allowed myself to feel the full magnitude of what we'd accomplished. My phone lit up with a news alert. Tom had been located in Singapore, his attempts to establish a rival company thwarted by the very legal protections he'd never bothered to read. The authorities there were being remarkably cooperative, their own investigation into his promised technology deals revealing a pattern of deception that spanned continents. Grace appeared with fresh coffee and the latest market reports. "Share prices hit another record high today," she reported, her smile reflecting my own satisfaction. "The analysts are calling it a masterclass in corporate governance reform." The company had not just survived Tom's betrayal, it had thrived. Our client base had grown, attracted by the transparency and integrity of our new leadership. The technologies he had tried to steal were being developed properly, under legitimate contracts that protected everyone's interests. A soft knock at the door announced James Parker's arrival. "The SEC just released their final report," he said, placing a thick document on my desk. "They're citing us as an example of successful corporate restructuring and fraud prevention." The irony wasn't lost on me. The very systems Tom had dismissed as unnecessary bureaucracy had ultimately protected the company he'd tried to destroy. Every policy I'd quietly implemented, every safeguard he'd mocked as excessive, had played its part in preserving what we'd built. My office, once Tom's domain, now reflected a different kind of power. Gone were the showy displays of success, replaced by evidence of actual achievement. Industry awards earned through innovation rather than charm. Client testimonials based on results rather than promises. Vanessa had found her own path to redemption, her testimony helping to close the loopholes Tom had exploited. Last I'd heard, she'd started a consulting firm specializing in corporate fraud prevention. Sometimes the best teachers are those who've learned the hardest lessons. The afternoon light faded as I reviewed the company's latest projects. Each proposal represented opportunity, not just for profit, but for proving that success could be achieved through integrity rather than deception. The legacy I was building would be measured not in dollars, but in trust earned and maintained. A message from Bernard Cooper appeared in my inbox. He'd accepted a position with a smaller firm, His reputation diminished, but his lessons learned. The corporate world could be unforgiving, but it also respected those who acknowledged their mistakes and worked to correct them. The snow continued to fall as evening approached, transforming the city into something magical and new. From my window, I could see the lights coming on in offices across the financial district, each one representing someone's ambition, someone's dream. How many other stories like mine were playing out behind those illuminated windows? My grandmother's. Watch showed 8 o'clock, time for one last meeting. The board had gathered in the main conference room, not for crisis management this time, but to review our plans for expansion. The company's future stretched before us, bright with possibility. As I gathered my materials, a final email notification caught my eye. Tom's Singapore lawyers requesting a settlement discussion. I left it unopened, like all his previous attempts at communication. Some bridges, once burned, should stay ashes. The conference room buzzed with energy as I entered. These were my people now, chosen for their integrity as much as their ability. Each face represented part of the new direction we were taking: innovative, ethical, focused on real value rather than quick profits. Looking out at their expectant faces, I felt a surge of pride. Not just in what we'd accomplished, but in how we'd done it. We'd proven that success didn't require deception, that power didn't have to corrupt, that a company could prosper through principle rather than manipulation. The snow fell faster now, erasing the day's footprints, preparing the ground for tomorrow's paths. In boardrooms and offices across the city, other women were facing their own battles, finding their own strength. My story was just one of many, a reminder that sometimes the quietest revolution is the most powerful. I opened my presentation, ready to lead my company into its next chapter. The past was settled, the lessons learned, the future beckoned, full of possibilities I'd once only dreamed of. This was my time, my company, my vision, and I'd earned every bit of it. Through the windows, Boston's lights twinkled like stars, each one a reminder of the dreams that brought people to this city, of ambition and opportunity. My own dream had evolved, transformed by betrayal into something stronger, more authentic, more real. The company would continue to grow, but on my terms now. Success would be measured not just in profits, but in the integrity with which we achieved them. Tom's shadow had faded, replaced by the bright reality of what Anderson Digital Solutions had become, what I had made it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.